History rarely announces the moment an empire begins to fall. There isn't a trumpet. There isn't a single battle where everyone suddenly realizes this is the end. Most people don't know they're watching history change, not until much later. Imagine you are 32 years old. You've spent nearly half your life in the Swedish army. You've marched across Europe behind a king who has never lost a major battle. You've stood victorious at Narva. You've crossed rivers, forests, and endless plains. You've survived winters so brutal that men froze where they stood. You've buried friends without graves because the ground was too hard to dig. And through all of it, you believed. You believed Sweden could not be defeated. You believed your king was chosen by God. You believed the empire would last forever. Now it's June 1709. The summer sun beats down on the dry plains outside a small town called Poltava. Smoke hangs in the air. The thunder of rushing cannons never seems to stop. Somewhere behind you, your king lies on a stretcher, unable to ride, unable to lead. For the first time, the impossible begins to feel possible. Not that you might lose a battle, that Sweden might lose an empire. By the end of the day, thousands of your fellow soldiers will be dead. Thousands more will begin to march into Russian captivity, from which many never return. And the nation that once shocked Europe by marching an army across a frozen sea will never again be the same. This is the story of how an empire fell. Welcome back to Beyond the Swedish Postcard. Last time, we explored one of the darkest chapters in Swedish history, the Great Noise, when fear became evidence and children sent hundreds of people to their deaths. Today, we're staying in the Storm Extid, but we're leaving the villages behind, because while ordinary Swedes were living through fear, something else was happening beyond their fields and forests. The empire they had spent generations building was beginning to crack. Not all at once, but little by little. They began making decisions that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. A campaign here, another victory there, one more march, one more battle, until one day, people wake up and realize the world they thought would last forever is gone. Today, we're going to follow one of history's most remarkable kings, a young man who won battles that should have been impossible, who terrified the crowned heads of Europe before he was 20 years old, and who, in chasing one final victory, lost an empire. This is the story of Charles XII, the Great Northern War, and the day Sweden stopped being one of Europe's great powers. To understand how an empire falls, you have to first understand why everyone believed it couldn't. By the end of the 17th century, Sweden had accomplished something that seemed impossible. This wasn't Europe's largest kingdom. It wasn't the richest. It wasn't even close to the most populous. Sweden had perhaps 1.5 million people. France had more than 20 million. Russia stretched across continents. The Holy Roman Empire contained hundreds of states and millions upon millions of people. On paper, Sweden shouldn't have been a great power at all, and yet, for almost a century, it was. Its armies defeated enemies much larger than themselves. Its diplomats sat at Europe's negotiating tables. Its kings drew maps. For a brief moment in history, the Baltic Sea became something close to a Swedish lake. How does something like that happen? Part of the answer was extraordinary leadership. Kings like Gustavus Adolphus transformed the Swedish army into one of the most disciplined fighting forces in Europe. His military innovations changed warfare itself, and those reforms continued long after his death. But victories alone don't build an empire. You also need an empire that can survive between wars, and that responsibility fell to Charles XI. Unlike his father, Charles X Gustav, Charles XI wasn't remembered as a great conqueror. He was a builder. He strengthened the royal government, reduced the power of the nobility, reformed the kingdom's finances, and perhaps most importantly, he transformed the Swedish military into a permanent institution through the allotment system known in Sweden as indelningsverket. Groups of farms supported individual soldiers. Those soldiers trained regularly and could be mobilized quickly whenever a war came. It gave Sweden something many European powers struggled to maintain, a professional army that was always ready. It was an extraordinary achievement, but it also created a dangerous illusion. When a nation wins for long enough, people begin to believe winning is normal, that tomorrow will look just like yesterday, that success is permanent. History has a way of punishing that kind of certainty. In April of 1697, Charles XI died, and the most powerful military machine in Northern Europe was inherited by a 14-year-old boy. In April of 1697, the king was dead. Charles XI had ruled Sweden for nearly 3 decades. He left behind a disciplined army, a strengthened crown, and an empire that seemed secure. But he also left behind a problem. His only son, Charles XII, was 14 years old. Imagine hearing that news if you were another ruler in Europe. For decades, Sweden had been the power no one wanted to fight. Now its throne belonged to a teenager. History gives us the advantage of knowing what happened next. The people living through it didn't. They couldn't know whether this young king would be brilliant or weak, whether he would lead armies or hide behind advisors, whether he would preserve the empire or lose it. To the outside world, he looked like an opportunity. Charles himself didn't seem especially interested in ruling. As a boy, he preferred hunting to court ceremonies. He rode horses, hunted wolves and bears, and threw himself into physical challenges with an intensity that worried some of the adults around him. He disliked elaborate court life and had little patience for the formalities expected of a European prince. He was intelligent, reserved, deeply religious, and intensely private. Very little about him suggested he would become one of Europe's most feared battlefield commanders. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of appointing a regency to govern until Charles came of age, the Swedish government declared him an adult. At just 15 years old, Charles XII became king in his own right. It was an extraordinary gamble. An empire stretching from northern Germany to Finland was now being led by someone too young to vote in many countries today. Outside Sweden, people were watching, some with curiosity, others with ambition. Kingdoms seldom choose the hour of war. Their enemies do. And to Denmark, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, that moment had finally arrived. The news spread quickly across Europe. The old king was dead. A 15-year-old now ruled the Swedish Empire. For Sweden, it was a moment of uncertainty. For its enemies, it looked like an opportunity. No empire becomes powerful without making enemies. Sweden had spent the better part of a century defeating its neighbors, taking territory, and reshaping the balance of power in Northern Europe. Those defeats hadn't been forgotten. They'd simply been waiting for the right moment. And in 1697, that moment seemed to have arrived. Three rulers, each with their own ambitions, looked north and reached remarkably similar conclusions. Sweden was vulnerable. The first was King Frederick IV of Norway and Denmark. No country had suffered more at Sweden's hands than Denmark. The humiliating Treaty of Roskilde in 1658 had forced Denmark to surrender provinces it had considered its own for centuries, including Skåne, Halland, and Blekinge. Those losses weren't ancient history. Many people who remembered them were still alive. Frederick wanted them back. The second king was Augustus II, better known as Augustus the Strong. He ruled Saxony and had recently become king of Poland-Lithuania. He dreamed of expanding his influence around the Baltic, particularly by capturing Livonia and its wealthy city of Riga. A successful war against Sweden could transform his position in Europe. Then there was the younger ruler, a man only a few years older than Charles XII, Peter, Tsar of Russia. Unlike Denmark or Poland, Russia's ambitions reached beyond recovering lost territory. Peter wanted something far more important: an opening to Europe. For centuries, Russia had struggled to secure reliable access to warm water ports and the trade routes of the Baltic Sea. Peter believed his country's future depended on breaking that isolation. To do that, Sweden stood in the way. On their own, none of these rulers wanted to challenge Sweden. The Swedish army still carried a fearsome reputation. Its victories under Gustavus Adolphus and Charles X Gustav had become the stuff of legend. But together, they believed they had a chance. A teenage king, three ambitious neighbors, one empire that suddenly looked vulnerable. In 1699, they formed a secret alliance. The plan was simple: attack Sweden from different directions, all at once. Overwhelm the young king before he had time to react. It seemed like a sound strategy. In fact, it looked almost impossible for Sweden to survive. The coalition believed they were about to divide an empire. Instead, they were about to create a legend. When the attacks finally came, they came almost simultaneously. Denmark moved first, attacking Sweden's ally Holstein-Gottorp. Augustus the Strong laid siege to Riga and Livonia. And in the east, Peter the Great marched toward the fortress city of Narva with an army that vastly outnumbered the Swedish defenders. It was exactly the kind of coordinated attack the coalition had planned. 3 enemies, 3 fronts, 1 teenage king. If Charles tried to defend everything, he would defend nothing. So he made a decision that surprised everyone. He ignored the largest threat. Instead, he attacked Denmark first. It was a bold gamble. With the support of the English and Dutch fleets, Swedish forces landed near Copenhagen. The campaign moved so quickly that Denmark was forced to seek peace within a matter of weeks, signing the Treaty of Travendal in August of 1700 and withdrawing from the war. 1 enemy gone. But there was no time to celebrate. Far to the east, Narva was still under siege. Peter's army numbered somewhere between 35,000 to 50,000 men. The sources are not clear on the exact number, but history throws numbers around so casually. 40 to 50,000. We read it, our brains acknowledge, and we move on. But what does 40 to 50,000 people actually look like? Imagine filling nearly half of Bryant-Denny Stadium. or all of the Strawberry Arena in Stockholm. Not with fans, with soldiers. Every section, every row, every seat. Then imagine walking toward that stadium knowing that those people, the 40 to 50,000 people, are waiting on you. Charles could only bring about 10,000. Even by the standards of the time, those odds were daunting. Most commanders would have waited, gathered reinforcements, looked for a better opportunity. Charles marched straight toward the Russian army. As the Swedish soldiers approached Narva in November 1700, the weather changed. A snowstorm swept across the battlefield. The wind blew directly in the faces of the Russian troops. For the Swedes, it became a curtain. Hidden by the storm, Swedish infantry advanced across the frozen ground before the Russians fully realized what was happening. Then, with astonishing speed, they smashed into the Russian lines. The Russian army began to collapse. Some soldiers fled. Others tried to cross the Narva River. Many drowned. Thousands surrendered. When the fighting ended, the impossible had happened. An army outnumbered nearly 4-1 had shattered one of Europe's largest armies. The victory stunned Europe. It transformed a 15-year-old king into an international legend almost overnight. Across Europe, Charles XII was no longer seen as an inexperienced boy who had inherited an empire. He was now regarded as one of the most formidable military commanders of his generation. And then, Charles made the decision that historians have debated for more than 300 years. He didn't march on Moscow. He let Peter escape. Europe couldn't believe what had happened. A 15-year-old king had defeated one of the largest armies on the continent. The coalition that had expected Sweden to collapse was already beginning to fall apart. Russia had been humiliated. Its army was shattered. Many historians have looked back at that moment and asked the same question. Why didn't Charles march straight towards Moscow? It seems obvious to us now. Russia was weak. Peter's army had been destroyed. If there was ever a moment to end the war, this appeared to be it. But Charles wasn't looking at history. He was looking at the world in front of him. From his perspective, Russia was no longer the greatest threat. Peter had lost. Augustus the Strong had not. As long as Augustus remained king of Poland, Lithuania, and elector of Saxony, Sweden still faced a powerful enemy capable of rebuilding the coalition. Charles believed he couldn't leave that threat behind him, so instead of marching east, he turned south. For the next several years, Charles pursued Augustus across Poland, Lithuania, and Saxony. He won battle after battle, forcing Augustus to retreat again and again before finally compelling him to renounce the Polish crown in 1706. From a military standpoint, it worked. Augustus was defeated. Sweden's reputation became even greater. Charles seemed unstoppable. But while Europe watched Sweden win victories in Poland, something equally important was happening far to the east. Peter the Great had learned something about Narva. He couldn't defeat the Swedish army yet. So he decided to build a new one. Instead of chasing Charles across Europe, Peter reorganized his military, trained new officers, modernized his artillery, and expanded Russian industry to support a larger, more disciplined army. At the same time, he founded a new city on the Baltic coast, St. Petersburg, a symbol of his determination to turn Russia toward Europe. Charles spent 6 years winning battles. Peter spent 6 years preparing for one. By the time the Swedish king finally turned east, he wasn't marching towards the same Russia he had defeated at Narva. He was marching toward an entirely different enemy. By 1707, Charles XII had accomplished almost everything he set out to do. Augustus the Strong had been defeated. The coalition that had threatened Sweden had fallen apart. For nearly 7 years, Charles hadn't really lost. Battle after battle, campaign after campaign, the impossible had become expected. But one enemy remained, Peter. The Tsar, who had fled after Narva, was still there. A new army, new artillery, new factories, new officers. While Charles had been winning victories, Peter had been preparing for revenge. Eventually, there was no avoiding it. In the autumn of 1707, Charles turned east. His destination wasn't just Russia, it was history. At first, everything looked familiar. The Swedish army marched with incredible discipline. Its soldiers had become veterans after years of campaigning. Many had followed Charles across half of Europe. They trusted him completely. And why wouldn't they? Every gamble he had taken had worked. Every impossible battle had somehow ended in victory. When you've won for that long, you stop asking whether something is possible, and you begin asking how long it will take. Charles expected Peter to do what European kings had always done: meet him in battle, lose, negotiate peace. That had been the pattern for years. Peter had no intention of following it. Instead, he simply disappeared. The Russian army retreated deeper into its own country. Villages were abandoned, food stores were burned, bridges destroyed, livestock driven away. Anything that might feed the Swedish army vanished before they arrived. Imagine marching for weeks, only to find empty villages, cold fireplaces, fields with nothing left to harvest, no enemy to fight, no victory to win, just another road stretching east. It must have been maddening. This wasn't the kind of war Charles knew how to fight. He had built his reputation on decisive battles. Peter refused to give him one. Every kilometer the Swedes marched, their supply lines became longer. Every wagon had farther to travel. Every horse had less to eat. Every soldier carried a little less hope than the day before. And yet, they kept marching. Because after 7 years of victory, turning back may have seemed harder than pressing forward. Charles still believed one decisive battle would end the war. Peter believed every mile Charles marched brought Sweden closer to defeat. Only one of them was right. Autumn slowly disappeared. The roads turned to mud. The mud froze. Then the snow came. By now, the Swedish army had marched hundreds of kilometers into Russia. Every step carried them farther from home. Every step stretched their supply lines a little thinner. Peter still refused to fight. Instead, the Russians stayed just out of reach. Close enough to watch, far enough to avoid battle. If Charles wanted a decisive victory, he was going to have to keep chasing it. And so he did. The further the Swedish army marched, the harder it became to survive. Food grew scarce. Horses died from exhaustion and lack of fodder. Every dead horse meant fewer wagons could carry supplies. Every abandoned wagon meant fewer supplies reached the men. It became a cycle that fed itself. The army wasn't being destroyed by one great battle. It was being worn down, day after day, one empty village at a time, one missed meal at a time, one freezing night at a time. Peter understood something Charles did not. Sometimes the easiest battle to win is the one you never fight. Then, just when the Swedes believed help might finally arrive, another disaster struck. Charles had placed great hopes in an alliance with the Ukrainian Cossack leader Ivan Mazepa. Mazepa promised food, fresh horses, new soldiers, most importantly, a place where the exhausted Swedish army could finally recover. Instead, Peter moved first. Russian forces captured Mazepa's capital before the Swedes could reach it. The city was destroyed. Its vast stores of food, ammunition, and supplies were burned or seized. Whatever hopes Charles had of replenishing his army vanished in smoke. For the Swedish soldiers, the campaign suddenly became something very different. They were no longer marching toward victory. They were marching toward survival. Then came the winter, not an ordinary winter. The winter of 1708 to 1709 became one of the coldest Europe had experienced in generations. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Men woke to find boots frozen solid. Weapons became difficult to handle with numb hands. Horses collapsed in the snow and never stood again. Some soldiers froze to death before morning. Others succumbed to disease or hunger. Thousands simply disappeared from the ranks, not in battle, but to the relentless cold and exhaustion. Imagine being one of those soldiers. You've followed your king across Europe. You have never known defeat. You've survived impossible battles. But now, your greatest enemy isn't the Russian army. It's the weather. And the weather never surrenders. By the spring of 1709, the Swedish army that had crossed into Russia was only a shadow of itself. Charles still believed one decisive battle could save everything. Peter believed the battle had already begun months earlier. One king was still looking for victory. The other had quietly reshaped the battlefield itself. Neither man knew it yet, but they were now marching toward a small Ukrainian town. Its name was Poltava. By the summer of 1709, everything had come down to this. For nearly a decade, Charles XII had done what many believed was impossible. He had defeated larger armies, broken coalitions, forced kings from their thrones, marched farther than almost any European army dared. Again and again, he had proved his enemies wrong. Now, he just needed one more victory. Just one. Because one battle could still change everything. But Charles wouldn't lead this battle the way he had led all the others. Just weeks before the armies met, he was inspecting the front lines when a Russian bullet struck his foot. The wound became infected. Walking was almost impossible. The king, who had always fought alongside his soldiers, would have to command from a stretcher. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just another king sitting safely behind his army. Charles had built his reputation by being everywhere. At Narva, his soldiers could see him. During years of campaigning, They had watched him share the same hardships they did. Now, for the first time, they couldn't. That matters. In war, leadership isn't only about giving orders. Sometimes it's about being seen. Across the battlefield, Peter had changed as well. The young Tsar who had watched his army collapse at Narva was gone. In his place stood a commander who had spent 9 years at this point learning from defeat. His army was larger, better trained, better supplied. His artillery had improved dramatically. And perhaps most importantly, he had learned patience. He no longer needed to defeat Charles in a spectacular charge. He simply needed to let the exhausted Swedish army make the first mistake. The Swedish plan depended on speed, attack before dawn, break through the Russian defensive positions, force Peter into open battle. The kind of battle Charles had won so many times before. Instead, almost immediately, things began to go wrong. Columns lost contact with one another in the darkness. Some units became delayed. Others attacked too quickly. The carefully planned surprise began to unravel, and every minute that passed worked in Peter's favor. Imagine standing in those ranks. You're exhausted. You've marched across Europe. You've survived hunger, disease, and one of the coldest winters anyone can remember. You still believe your king has never truly been beaten. You still believe somehow he'll find a way. Then the Russian artillery opens fire. Not once, not twice, again and again and again. For many Swedish soldiers, this was unlike anything they had experienced before. Years of campaigning had taught them to rely on aggressive attacks and close combat. Now they had to advance against an enemy prepared with strong defensive positions and powerful artillery. The confidence that had carried Sweden across Europe finally met something it couldn't overcome. The attack stalled. The Russian lines held. Fresh Russian troops pushed forward. The Swedish formations began to break. For the first time in Charles XII's reign, there was no miracle. By the end of the battle, the Swedish army had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. Thousands were dead. Thousands more were captured in the days that followed. The empire that had seemed invincible only a few years earlier would never recover. Charles escaped. A handful of loyal soldiers carried their wounded king away from the battlefield. Behind them, the road they had marched for years was ending, not because they had stopped believing, but because history had finally caught up with them. Poltava wasn't the end of the Great Northern War, but it was the end of something else. For nearly a century, Sweden had been the power that shaped Northern Europe. Its armies had marched where they pleased. Its kings had dictated peace. Its neighbors had feared the blue and yellow banners appearing on the horizon. After Poltava, that fear began to disappear. Charles XII escaped with a small group of followers. The wounded king crossed the Dnieper River and eventually reached the Ottoman Empire, where he hoped to persuade the Ottoman Sultan to continue the war against Russia. Imagine that journey. Only weeks earlier, he had commanded one of Europe's finest armies. Now he was a refugee. Still a king, but a king without an army. Charles remained in Ottoman territory for years. He refused to accept defeat. Again and again, he tried to convince the Ottoman Empire to renew the fight against Peter. Sometimes he succeeded in influencing events. Often he didn't. At one point, Ottoman soldiers surrounded the house where Charles was staying after he refused to leave. The bizarre confrontation became known as the Kalaballik at Bender, one of the strangest episodes of European royal history. Even there, Charles reportedly fought with remarkable determination despite being hopelessly outnumbered. It sounds almost unbelievable. Even after losing an empire, he still refused to surrender. That tells you something about Charles XII. Whether you admire him or question his judgment, no one can accuse him of lacking conviction. Eventually, Charles returned to Sweden, but the country he came home to wasn't the same one he had left. Years of war had exhausted the kingdom. The army had to be rebuilt. The treasury was strained. Families across Sweden had lost fathers, sons, and brothers. The empire still existed, but it was no longer the empire of Narva. Still, Charles wasn't finished. Instead of seeking peace, he launched another campaign, this time against Norway. Even after years of warfare, Charles believed offensive action offered Sweden its best chance of improving its position before any peace negotiations. Then, on a cold November evening in 1718, everything stopped. While inspecting trenches outside the fortress of Frederiksson, Charles XII was struck in the head by a bullet. He died instantly. To this day, historians still debate where that bullet came from. Was it fired by the Norwegian defenders? Or did it come from someone on the Swedish side? More than 300 years later, no one knows for certain. His death changed everything. Without Charles, the war gradually came to an end. In 1721, the Treaty of Nystad formally concluded the Great Northern War. Sweden lost much of its territory around the Baltic. Russia emerged as the dominant power in Northern Europe. Peter, the young Tsar who had once watched his army collapse at Narva, had achieved exactly what he wanted: a window to Europe. Sweden remained an important kingdom, but it was no longer an empire. Think back to the beginning of this episode. We asked a simple question: how does an empire fall? Not all at once, not because of one battle, not because of one decision. Empires rise through countless choices, and they decline the same way. A brilliant victory can plant the seeds of a future defeat. A humiliating loss can become the beginning of renewal. Charles XII won battles that should have been impossible. Peter the Great survived defeats that should have ended his reign. One king believed victory came through boldness. The other believed time itself could be a weapon. History tells us who won, but perhaps the more interesting question is, could either man have imagined the world they were creating? When Charles crossed into Russia in 1707, he was chasing a decisive victory. What he found instead was the end of an era. If you've ever wandered through Sweden's castles, walked the old fortress walls, or stood on the shores of the Baltic, it's worth remembering that many of those places weren't just built during Sweden's age as a great power. They survived it. Stone walls outlast kings. Empires disappear. Battlefields grow quiet. But the stories remain, waiting for someone to ask how it all happened. Thank you so much for joining me on another episode of Beyond the Swedish Postcard. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you'd follow the podcast and share it with someone who loves history, Sweden, or just a good story. And if there's a chapter of Swedish history you'd like for me to explore, let me know. I'd love to hear your ideas. Tack så mycket for listening. Hej då for now.